This picture right here of some, soldiers doing a winter exercise. I didn't take this picture, but of course I've seen snow before. So I can look at this picture and I can really wonder, that picture doesn't look neutral. There's a slight green cast. Now, if you don't either trust your own color vision or trust your monitor, what you always want to make sure you have open is the info palette. Because the info palette will always recognize a color cast. Now, I do color correction both in RGB and CMYK. My rule of thumb for doing color correction is define the neutrals first. All right, if I can find a neutral, which would be white, a midtone, which would be any shade of gray, there's lighter midtones, darker midtones, or a neutral black, most of the time 90% of your color problems are taken care of. So always start by defining a neutral. That's one reason I really like doing color correction in RGB, because if I have a neutral in RGB, for example, a neutral highlight, all of those highlight tones will be within 1 point of one another on the RGB readout in the info palette. The midtones will be like all in the 120s, but it'll be 120, 120, 120. That's a neutral gray. The dark tones, for example, a dark shadow would be 777. That's a neutral. So if you can find a neutral, you're pretty much set. So looking at the info palette, if I put my mouse into the picture, and it doesn't even have to be the eyedropper, I can put any tool into the picture. I'll tap I to get my eyedropper. I can see that RGB readout is 210, 221, and 211. Well, that's obviously not neutral because the green value is 10 to 11 points higher than the red or the blue. So this image has a green cast. And by defining a new neutral point, I'll be able to get rid of that very, very quickly. Now, once again, just like when we're working with tone and exposure, you want to start with the global issues first. Don't get obsessive and look at tiny little details. You never know. Sometimes by taking care of a neutral, you take care of all your problems and you've saved yourself a lot of work. So in this case, I'll go to my layers palette and I will drop down once again to my image adjustment layers and go to levels. And here's that histogram. Now, in order to define neutrals, these eyedroppers are tremendously important. So I'm going to take my white eyedropper, and there's no information in the sky, so I can literally just click right on that sky and define the sky as neutral. And now let's look for a shadow point. What do I want that would be very dark? I'll take the black eyedropper, and I can even zoom in here, and you see the shadow under the tank? I want that to be perfectly neutral. So let's see how we're doing here. And just like we did with the exposure, I can use my midtone slider to open up that image overall. So I'm actually taking care of some color and exposure issues all at once. So here, let me turn off that adjustment layer. That's before. And I'll bring up the info palette so you can see the difference. Before and after. And you can see that neutral sky is now 239, 239, 240. That's perfectly acceptable if one value is off by 1 pixel. That's being influenced by how I have my color settings set up. But that's pretty amazing how you can go from this type of greenish day to a very neutral day. And even if you were never there, find a reference. It could be a sidewalk, could be gray, could be someone's shirt collar, could be white. Find something black and use that to define your neutral source. Now, sometimes you might open up an image that looks as bad as this one on the left side of my screen. Very, very dark, very, very green. And in most cases, you would probably just want to very quickly close that image and hopefully never open it again. The problem is this might be the only picture that someone has of their family member. It might be from an important shoot. You've got to save this file, even though it's this dark and this green. So I want to show you, with a few clicks of the mouse, I went from this green mush to this image. And all I had to do was define a new neutral point. And that's what I'm going to do right here on the original image. So here's the original file. What I'm going to do is define a new white point. Now, before you start clicking around in a file, you really want to take a moment to look at it. And even on a file that is this hard to actually see into because it's so dark, you can already see that there's some shading coming down the left. There's sunlight on the left. And her dress, even though we're not sure what color it is, it's being pushed out by the wind. So there's a highlight sitting right there. And the highlight is something I can take advantage of to define a new neutral point. So I'm going to come to my image adjustment layer, drag down the levels. When you're using eyedroppers, you can use levels or curves. And I have this histogram here, which really shows how dark that image is. Well, won't work with that right now. I'll take my white eyedropper, and I'm going to click on that highlight. And look at what Photoshop did. It literally said, see this green scum, as I like to call it? Make that white. And by making everything that's green white, I've neutralized that terrible green cast. I can look over on the image, it's still too dark, use my midtones to lighten it up. You want to be gentle, you want to be careful, and I'm going to say okay. So look at this. There's before, and that's just by defining a new neutral point. I can actually save the image. Now, if I look at this histogram, remember in the beginning I was talking about all those white spikes? This is really, really a problem, because what Photoshop did was the histogram was all bunched over to the left-hand side. By defining a new white point, what Photoshop did was it took that little bit of information, it spread it out over the 255 values. So I'm trying to take advantage of that entire scale. Now, there's only so much information that I can actually stretch here. And what you're seeing here with those white bands are places where there's no image information. But in some cases, like this one, where the image was so dark and so green, I have to decide, am I more interested in making a good image or a good histogram? And in this case, the image is much more important, and I've tried to have salvaged the best that I could. When you see histograms like this, I can understand you might get nervous, but don't forget, we're not really in the business of printing histograms. We're in the business of creating and producing good images. And considering what we started with, green mush, to get to this with just a little bit of work, a few clicks, I think that's pretty amazing and really shows how much power there is in Photoshop. Another thing that you want to consider when you're doing color correction is what kind of color cast do you have? Now, color cast always sounds like it's something negative, but it really isn't, because a color cast can also add atmosphere. For example, if you took a picture with a candlelit dinner, that gold tone is going to be something that you want to keep. On the other side, there's also color casts that the environment might kick in. For example, on this file right here, we have this group photo of a class, and if you look closely at these people, they all look dead. Really pale, really slightly green. Now it's summertime and they're all very healthy and very much alive. What happened is the trees that they were sitting under filtered the light and turned them all slightly green. That's an example of a color cast that you want to get rid of. Now, by studying that picture and seeing, okay, they're slightly green, and I was there when the picture was taken, so I know what was going on with that tree, you can actually use that information to offset a color cast. So, what I'm going to do is use a new type of adjustment layer, and that is the color balance adjustment layer. Now, color balance lets you work in shadows, midtones, and highlights. Interestingly enough, most of your color cast problems are going to be in the highlights and the midtones. Yes, you'll have some color cast problems in the shadows, but it's very difficult to see. So concentrate highlights, midtones, and your shadows usually get cleaned up. It's sort of like they go along for the ride for free. Now, because I know that these people look slightly pale and slightly green because of that tree, I'm going to start with my midtones, and the opposite of green, that's the light from the tree, is magenta. So I can just come over here and move this slider towards the magenta, and you can see what's happening to their skin tones, how they're actually starting to get much rosier and much more neutral. Now, you don't want to go too far, because then they'll look sunburnt, but I can just do a little bit of magenta, and lots of times when you have a green color cast, you also have a cyan color cast. So I'll actually add in a little bit of red too, and you might want to try a little bit in that highlight also, a little bit of magenta, a little bit of red. I'm going to say okay and turn that off. That's without and that's on. So you can really see that difference in terms of how they look. Now, if thinking in opposites like this isn't very clear to you, there's a built-in ring around in Photoshop that you can use to practice your color correction. You know, what's the opposite of what? Now, I just use it for practice. I don't actually use it on a file because it's not in the image adjustment layer palette, and I don't want to actually change my image data. But if you want to practice your color correction and you want to learn about opposites, go under Image, Adjust, and drag all the way down to Variations. And what you'll see here, this is called a ring around. And Darkroom Labs have been using that to find color correction. And you can see the opposite play here. There's red, the opposite cyan. Remember the picture had a green problem, it's the opposite of magenta. And you can even practice color correcting with image variations. What I like doing is we have a slider here where you can control the strength of image adjust variations. And so what I do is I usually back off by 1 notch, and that gives me a little bit more leeway. So for example, if I wanted to take out some of that green, I would click once on magenta, and you'll see all the pictures get updated. Now magenta has been added to that file, and I can see it is now in the middle. Now I'll look around here, which other picture do I like? Oh, I like this red one, and I'll click on it. And to the upper left, what you can see is the original file is here, and this is where I'm going with that file. So you can see how this cool green file is being warmed up. If I like to, I can actually click OK, and that change gets applied. But notice it's not an image adjustment layer. So I just actually use that to practice and sometimes to find a color cast problem if I'm having a problem identifying it. Because the colors magenta and red are very close to one another, just like cyan and blue color problems are very close. And sometimes it's hard to figure out which color cast you're actually working with. So try the test with image adjust variations, undo it, and then go and use your color balance. And here you have much finer control than just that clicking. And now I can just warm those people right up and take out that green cast that the trees actually added. Now, an example of another unwanted color cast can be introduced either in film processing or scanning. This example here on screen, all right, it's a young couple and the image might have been taken during, sunset. I don't quite believe it because the light's a little harsh, but they are way too red. I mean, they look like they've been boiled. Now, we really need to back off on that color, and if you look at it, you think it's a color problem. What it really is a saturation problem. And that's another thing. When are you sure? Is it color or saturation? Well, the more you work on these images, the more experience you'll get. And especially in these reds and yellows, what I want you to try, if you ever run into this problem, is to go to your layers palette, drag down to hue saturation, and on the overall master, which will affect all channels equally, just push back on that saturation. And I'm actually going to cut out 45% of it. I'm going to say OK. And now look at this file. That's before, that's after. That's the actual file. This before looks so bad, it looks like someone might have actually added that intentionally, but it's too much. And if a color cast that is supposed to add atmosphere is that apparent, it's a real turnoff. So what you'd rather have is a file that's less saturated. And remember, you can always back off on the adjustment, and if I just start backing off the opacity, that file starts getting warmed up again. And what happens is, we're so sensitive to color, you'll learn that you only need a little bit of gel, a little bit of color to actually get the idea across that this is a warm scene, sunset, sunrise, however you want to see it. So lots of times just backing off on that saturation can really help a file. Another kind of color cast that can be added to an image is, let's say you're shooting film and you're shooting in a mixed light environment, or you're shooting in an environment where you have daylight film and suddenly you're in an office environment. You ever notice all the images are green? Well, that's because of the fluorescent tubes that are in this office lights. Or if you take that daylight film and you go into a stadium, suddenly all your pictures look orange. Well, that's because the sodium mercury, it's all orange. So our eyes don't see that because we balance out color in terms of lamps to neutral. But film doesn't know not to do that. So you'll come home from a trip to the stadium or the office and suddenly everybody's looking green or orange. And so what you can do is you can actually neutralize that color temperature problem with the following technique. And I use this one more often than I actually want to admit, because as you can see, I was taking pictures in a museum where you're really not supposed to take pictures. So what you want to do is sample the offending color. So I'm going to get the eyedropper, just tap eye, and I'm going to sample the offending color, which is that green fluorescent, from a midtone. Very important that you get a midtone sample. Then in your layers palette, you add an empty layer. See, there's absolutely nothing there. And you want to fill this empty layer with that offending color. You could go Edit, Fill, and we would use our foreground color and click OK. Or if you want to use the quick key on the Mac, it would be Option Delete, or on the PC, Alt Delete to force fill the foreground color. And so now I've got that color sitting on top of the picture. But I want to filter this picture with that color. Actually, I want to filter it with the opposite of that color, the exact opposite, which is sitting under Image, Adjust, Invert, or Command or Control I. And there's the magenta. Remember, magenta to green. But I need to only change the color. So I'm going to go and use my blending mode, not normal, but color. And it's starting to get very interesting. So now I have a magenta picture. Just take your opacity and put it down 50%, and you have a perfect color gel to offset your color balance problems. And I can prove how well it's working because in the background you see there's still daylight coming through the windows. And here on this left side, look at this saddle. There's still that red, the red velvet and the gold trim. And everything else in the picture is perfectly neutral. All of the armor and lights. Now sometimes when you use this technique, the image will get a little flat. You want to add a little more pop into it. So I will, in the end, usually go to my layers palette, add a curves adjustment layer, and just boost up my highlights and push down the shadows a touch and say okay. And that'll just add a little bit of snap back to the picture that it lost by being shot under the wrong light. So if you have any pictures like this, the green ones in the office or the orange ones shot under tungsten light, sample the offending color in a midtone, add a new layer, fill with that color, invert it, go color mode, blending mode color, drop down the opacity, and you have a perfect gel for that scene. You can take care of a lot of problems that way. Now remember, when you're doing color balance, always try to find a neutral. And you're going to try to find the neutral and hope that it takes care of the image overall, the global correction, okay? Because Photoshop's good enough to apply that color change to the whole file. So if you look at a file like this, here's a picture of some guy in a studio, and you're looking at it. Now, even if you didn't take the picture, it's odd, but every photographer has 3 color backgrounds in their studio: white, black, and gray. And if I look at this file, and don't forget to bring up that info palette, so I can see it's 136, 149, 135. And it's like, wait a minute, if that's a neutral gray, that green value is way too high. It's 13 points higher than the red or the blue. I know I have a green cast. Even if I can't see it, the info palette will always show it to me. So I'm thinking, I look at this picture, well, this is going to be a really easy job. I'll just go to my layers, drop down to levels, get the gray eyedropper. See, the gray eyedropper is active now. In a color image, you can use it to define a neutral point, and I'll click on that background. Now the background is neutral. Now let's look more closely at him. I'm going to zoom up a little bit. There's the neutral background with the info palette. So it's neutral. See that? But let's look at his face. Now, when you're doing color correction on skin, or flesh as we call it, there are certain standards that have been developed, and they've been developed in the printing industry. They're based on CMYK. This is good if you have a lot of pre-press experience. The problem is, a lot of people working in a desktop environment, we do our own scans, and as you might know, a scanner sees and describes information in RGB. Your monitor displays it in RGB, and lots of times if you're working with an inkjet printer, you'll actually send it an RGB file, and it internally will convert that file to either CMYK or the 6-color printers, CMYK plus another cyan and another magenta ink. And you don't have to think of that conversion. So if you're used to working for pre-press and working with CMYK, you can actually change your readout here, work with CMYK, and I like using my info palette to reflect RGB and CMYK when I'm doing color correction of skin tones. Now, in CMYK, a young Caucasian person, young, we're talking like teenager and younger, well, they will have a 0 cyan, and the magenta and the yellow will be pretty much even. You know, we're talking 12 to 18% of each, yellow and magenta. And there'll be no K on the K plate, which is the black plate. Now, the older a person gets, the more sun exposure they get, the tanner they are, the yellow values will start increasing. Also, you'll see the cyan starting to creep up, just a few points to 4, 5, 6%. But the older person gets, the yellow values will be up to 1/3 higher than your magenta values. And then if the person's very ruddy or of African descent, you will actually see the K value increase because you need that black plate to show the darker skin. Now, if you have an RGB file, what are you supposed to do? I don't want you to go, oh my goodness, I have to do my color correction CMYK. You don't want to go image mode CMYK, do the color correction, then maybe go back to RGB. That's very destructive. What you can do is keep your eye on the CMYK values, if it's an RGB file, and I'll be doing color correction with both RGB and CMYK, and also keep your eye on the RGB. And what you can do is you can think about it. And if this is a Caucasian person, the values RGB, the B, the blue, will be the lowest. That makes sense, because remember the yellow is the highest. Blue will always be the lowest, the green will be in the middle, and the red will be the higher of the values. Not by a lot over the green, maybe 8 to 10 points, but your blue will always be the lowest. And you can keep that in mind and keep your eye on the CMYK settings, you'll be pretty much set. So if I look at this guy's skin here, and I look at the info palette, you know, he's really not that old. And if I look at the CMYK values, there's 3% cyan, 21% magenta, and 38% yellow. Yikes, that's way too much yellow. That's more than a third. A third in this case would be about 21% magenta and 30 yellow. So there's too much yellow in that skin. So what I want to do is pull the yellow out of the skin, but I don't want to affect anything else. And this is where you want to start learning how to think like Photoshop. It's like, okay, pull the yellow out of the skin. What I need to do is, first of all, always identify in the file, where's the problem? Well, the problem, and which layer is it on? The problem is not on my levels layer. That's just neutralizing the midtones. The problem is actually on my background layer. That's the original color cast problem. So what I want to tell Photoshop to do is show me just the yellows. And what I'm going to do is use, remember the Smart Magic Wand. I'm going to go select color range and tell Photoshop, just show me the yellows. And if you look very, very closely, you can see a very fine, lighter area. Well, that's where Photoshop is seeing yellow. Notice in the background, it's completely black. Well, of course it is. That's been neutralized. I'm going to click OK. In many cases, when you're working with a fine color cast, Photoshop will give you this warning saying, what it really says is, I can't show you the dancing ants. I can't show you the selection. It's okay. Just click OK, because now I'm going to add an adjustment layer. And I'm going to drop down to, I could use hue saturation or selective color. Let's use hue saturation. And look at what Photoshop did. It added that mask based on that selection. And I'm actually going to drop down to my yellows, and I'm going to pull out all the saturation out of the yellows. Now this is a very, very extreme move. You might be going, oh my goodness, she's taking all the yellow out. But look at his skin. I took all of the yellow out of that yellow selection. So you can start actually making larger moves than you might be used to. So let's go look at the skin tones now with the color picker, and look at what happened to my CMY. How now my magenta and yellow are much more in sync, and the blue values have also come up. And he suddenly looks much healthier. Let me turn this off again. Very yellow, turn it back on, and now that yellow has been taken out. So you can actually make a selection and then use an adjustment layer to really pull out these values very, very selectively and very carefully. And the initial selection will protect the other areas that you don't want to affect at all. Now in the following exercises, we want to do color correction on skin tones. And it's amazing how sensitive our eyes are to skin tones. Now that means it's because we've been living for thousands and thousands of years, and we've actually developed a very keen sense on, is someone's skin tone, are they healthy? I mean, if they're slightly green, you would like kick them out of your cave to survive. Or are they sick? You know, kick them out of the cave. And that's where our sensitivity to a lot of these skin tones come from. Now, the problem with that is you can't just say, oh, just pull out green and person will look healthier, because every single person has numerous skin tones on their face. So when you're doing color correction of skin tones, you really want to take a moment, put down your mouse and take a moment and look at the person. And you want to look at them in terms of their age, what kind of heritage they have, how much sun exposure they've had, etc. Because remember, age will make a person look darker. Your cyans will increase. Sun exposure, cyan and K values will increase. Heritage, of course, is going to influence your color balance. Another thing you want to be careful of when you're doing color balance is, we are going to use the info palette, but you want to try to find the place on the person's face that's neutral. Now with women, you want to be very careful. Of course, you're not going to measure the lips or the eyelids, because that's most likely where the most makeup is going to be. You also don't want to measure an area that has a lot of shadow information, because that can throw off your measurement also. So try to find a neutral area, look at the image, identify the person in the picture, really try to understand who that person is. Now in this example here, I have a young, attractive woman. She's got dark hair, dark eyes. And if I come in here with my info palette, I've got both my RGB and my CMYK info palette open. Let's see what kind of file it is. Okay, this is a CMYK file. See, it's already in CMYK. So I will do my color correction based on these CMYK values. Now, what I can do is in the toolbar, I can come over here and get a color sampler. And Photoshop will let you add up to 4 color samples. And the way I like thinking of that are your midtones, your shadows, your highlights, and the 4th I always use for my flesh tones. So I'm going to actually use this one here, my first one, to monitor my flesh tones. And what I can see here are the values. 5% cyan, 15% magenta, 32% yellow, and 0K. Once again, a person that is this young, that's too much yellow. I'm going to have to reduce that yellow. I'm also going to reduce the cyan, which will clean up the face overall, make it a little lighter, a little brighter. And I'm going to boost the magenta a little bit to make her a little healthier looking. Now I'm doing all of this to flatter the actual person in the picture. So it takes a little practice, but since you're using adjustment layers, you can experiment and keep trying until you get an effect that you like. Now, because I'm in CMYK and I want to do fine color correction, whenever you want to do a fine color correction, you should be thinking curves. Because what curves lets you do is, if I work on the overall here, the CMYK, or an RGB file, it would say RGB. When you work on this overall curve, you're actually affecting tone, exposure, and contrast. If you want to do fine color correction, you'd actually work on the individual channels, cyan, magenta, yellow, or black. So let's look at the info palette, and I said I was going to reduce that yellow. So I'm going to drop down to my yellow plate. If I click and hold the mouse button down, you'll notice that there's a slight circle that dances around that curves handle. That's Photoshop telling you exactly where your eyedropper is at that moment. Well, I want to work on that specific skin tone. So what I'm going to do on a Mac, I'm going to Command click, on a PC Control click on the image, and Photoshop will add a handle on the curve at that exact place. This is fantastic because rather than trying to grab that little handle, I'll just use the up and down arrows on the keyboard, and if I want to take yellow out, I'm just going to move that point down, and I can see the yellow being taken out. And if I watch my info palette right here, that's where that color sample is. Look at what happened to my yellow. It went from 32 to 27. So 5% yellow have gotten taken out. I can now go to my other channels that I want to work on, and let's add a little bit of magenta into that file. So once again, Command or Control click. Now if I want to add magenta, I'm actually going to push that value up very slightly. And I'm going to do the same thing on the cyan. Go up to the cyan, Command or Control click. I want to take cyan out. Just going to take out a tiny little bit of cyan.